Guys, the attendance is on. Okay, I think we can probably start. We have a lot of content in this particular week, so maybe we should start. Uh, so again, I do not expect that you would have seen these lectures, but please go through them as you get time. I'm just going to browse through the lecture to show you what exactly is the content, and if anything comes to your mind, you can certainly ask. Okay. So, one of the things that we have already seen is that in order to show the structural aspect of a system, one of the ways to do so is by trying to model the classes that are there, right? So, if you know what classes are there and how do they relate to each other, you can give me a very good structural idea of your system. But when it comes to the behavioral aspects, when it comes to depicting how this system behaves at the runtime, we have to show interactions. Okay, interactions as in how does one object, how does one runtime entity interacts with another runtime entity. So the state diagram was basically focused towards one object only, right? So the objective of a state diagram was to show how a particular object behaves when the system is executing. And if you wanted to know a broader picture, a bigger picture of the system, that was, the only way you could have done it is by examining multiple state diagrams and then trying to stitch together a picture of what exactly is happening. So there are some diagrams which can help you with this as well. To be particular, the sequence diagram is a diagram that can somehow stitch together the information that is provided by different state diagrams. Now, the sequence diagram itself is actually a very complicated diagram. You can show a number of things within the sequence diagram, but for our purposes, where we are only trying to provide extremely basic information about a system, a sequence diagram can be helpful in basically showing the interactions with, in between the objects. So the state diagram shows how the object changes with respect to an event, and the sequence diagram we are going to use in order to show exactly how these events impact, right? And how one object can impact another object, right? So whatever we have seen as events in state diagrams, when you try to create a sequence diagram, the idea is now these events become far more easily understandable, because I told you that events might not be something that is relevant for just one particular object. If it is relevant for just one particular object, then within a sequence diagram you'll see a self loop as in, we'll see that this event is only it only affects this particular object. But usually there will be events which are generated by one object, and let us say it affects another object, or there will be cases of other types of communication between two objects. So in order to change its state, an object might need to communicate with another object. Okay, it might need some information from another object. So all these kind of scenarios where two or more objects need to interact with each other in order to achieve some functionality, such a kind of scenario can be represented using sequence diagrams. So a sequence diagram, as I said, can have a number of details. We are only going to discuss a subset of such details, because we are not really modeling extremely complicated systems. We are basically trying to learn some UML so that whatever projects you guys are building, you can express some details, some behavioral details about your projects. So in our version of the sequence diagram, which is basically a very simple version, there are the only things that you have to understand is that a sequence diagram consists of vertical and horizontal elements. The vertical elements basically showcase an object. So they tell you that this is an object and that is the type of this object. And the horizontal elements show you the interaction between different objects. So that is a very simple and very useful way to think about what sequence diagrams are. So this is what a typical sequence diagram looks like. In the beginning, you have these objects of different classes, and by the way, you can have multiple objects of the same class as well, right? So for example, it is possible to have two objects of the class customer. Okay, so you can say primary customer and the secondary customer. If it is an account which has two it's a joint account where there are two customers that are associated with the same account. Within the sequence diagram, you can, for example, have a scenario where there are two objects of exactly the same type. But it's up to you, right? It's up to you about what do you want to depict in a sequence diagram. But whatever you want to show, this is probably the starting point that you create. You create these boxes, you name them with the object that you want to display, and then you draw that dotted line, right? That dotted line is also known as the lifeline. So the reason for drawing these lines is that sequence diagrams show you how these things happen in the temporal view as in related to time. So they try to show you what are the sequences of different events as they happen when the system is executed. Remember that the state diagram does not show you the sequence of events. I mean, you can say that this state goes to this state when this event happens, but it doesn't tell you when exactly will these events happen, right? So this is where sequence diagram is going to be used. That here you can use it to tell what are the important events in your system and how do these events impact different objects. Okay, so this is the major use of sequence diagram. So on that lifeline, you would probably want to say that this particular object gets affected when this particular event takes place, right? So whenever you want to show an interaction, okay, whenever you want to show that something is happening to an object, you add an activation to it. Okay, so an activation is basically something like this. Okay, you put in small rectangles. So this lifeline basically means that this is the object is currently active, but it is not being changed, right? The state is basically the same, and at this point of time something is happening. Wherever you show these small rectangles, these are activations. These actually show that something is happening with this object. Okay, and there are different types of interactions that you could show. Here I have shown only two basic types. In fact, you can call it three, wherever the event that has happened, it is only something that affects this particular object. I show a kind of self loop. Okay, so this is an event which is pretty much internal to this object. It doesn't really affect the external world, the other objects. If the event is something that is going to affect the others, you show it like a signal. So essentially you have one object here that is going to generate an event, and this event needs to be propagated to another object. So this object must know that something has happened. And in the most general case, you just probably need a function call, right? So you need some information from another object. So there you make a call to the object and then you get a return from it. So these are some of the things that you show in a sequence diagram, in a typical sequence diagram. Now it is up to you whether you would like to use it or not for your project. The only thing that you have to keep in mind is that whenever you move from top to bottom, the only thing that sequence diagram shows is that there is some kind of uh, relative ordering. So this event takes place before this, and this event is after this event. It doesn't actually tell you the actual amount of time that elapsed between these two. Okay, so these are not to scale, for example. The only thing that sequence diagram tells you is that this event happens before this event. That is it. So any questions on this? Okay, so this sequence diagram was used, for example, to showcase how exactly do events take place in over a timeline. Okay, so which event occurs before and which event occurs after that. Now, as I said, this is something that gives you a broader picture of the system. State diagrams were pretty specific. Sequence diagrams can be system wide. You can show system wide interactions using the sequence diagram. So there's another diagram which is used to show an even higher level of system design, and these are known as use case diagrams. So use cases are essentially whatever I have asked you right till now to do for your projects. I have asked you to formalize all your requirements. A requirement is loosely interpreted as a use case. Okay, so if you elaborate your requirement in a good fashion, you can basically call it a use case. So the idea is that use case is something which the user tells you. Okay, the user comes to you and say, okay, this is, if this is the system, this is what I expect from it, right? This is what I expect to do from it, right? So there is this whole concept of an actor. An actor is basically an entity which is not a part of the system, but who is going to interact with the system, right? So the typical example of an actor is the user itself. You know, the user is going to come and interact with your system. The user is not a part of your system, but the user is supposed to interact. Similarly, another actor in your system could be, let us say, someone who is maintaining your code. Okay, so that person is also probably an actor. So you would like some information to be generated for maintenance purposes. The classic example is logging, that you would like to generate some logs so that these logs can be interpreted by a person who's maintaining the code. And these actors need not necessarily be just human beings. Okay, actors could also be external APIs, for example, right? So these external APIs might you might access some external APIs from your system, or your system might be accessed by other external APIs. So I mean, anything that is going to interact with the system, but that is not really a part of the system, is an actor. So a use case diagram is something that displays the relationship between actors and the system itself, right? So the idea is to show how different parts of my system, specifically how different use cases that I have in my system, are associated with different actors, or how do they impact different actors. So this is a typical example. Just assume that actors could be customers or administrators, and these use cases are something like the user will come to your system and create some kind of a service request, and then the administrator, assume that in the case of a bank, these administrators are people, the employees of the bank. They will log into the same system, and they will either approve or reject a service request. So this is a use case, approval or rejection, that is associated with, let us say, the employees of the bank. And these are some use cases that are associated with the user of the bank. So a use case diagram is like this. You basically put in your use cases, and then you try to show how different actors are impacted by different use cases of the system. Any queries on this? Only one object, so it's okay. So the issue here is that maybe then, if you have only one object, then the best diagram that you can use is the state diagram. In the state diagram, because if you have only one object, then the only thing that is going to happen is that your system is going to change, right, from one point to another, and this means a change to that particular object. So in that case, the best diagram to use is the state diagram. You don't need any other diagram if you just have one object in your system. Okay, any other questions? So this is what a use case diagram looks like. Essentially, a use case diagram links the actors associated with your system to your system. This is the major contribution of a use case diagram. And there is one more interaction diagram that you should know about, and it is known as the activity diagram. So an activity diagram is very similar. In fact, when you will start looking at activity diagrams, you might at times confuse them with flow charts. Okay, so I think many of you would have seen flow charts when we were doing ITP, right? Because this is a very common way to showcase someone how exactly does a process work, right? So in a flow chart, usually uh, you don't focus on the actual data. So you have to understand that state diagram is a data oriented diagram, right? You basically show how data changes its state from one point to another. Similarly, the sequence diagram too is in some ways it's about the objects, right? You are trying to show how the objects interact with each other. The activity diagram is a completely different scenario itself. It's a completely different type of diagram. This is used when you want to showcase your system more as a composition of operations rather than a composition of different types of objects. Okay, in fact activity diagrams are are useful even when you are not using object oriented design. Okay, these diagrams can be used even if your system is not really object oriented. Why? Because the activity diagrams tries to focus more on the operations that your system performs, and then it shows how these operations are performed at the runtime. Okay, so you typically create one activity diagram for one end to end operation. In many cases this end to end operation also means one use case. Okay, so you prepare one activity diagram for each use case that you have. So for example, if the use case is creating a service request, so your activity diagram will tell precisely step by step how exactly can a new service request can be created on the internet banking website. So that is how the activity diagrams are used. So you basically show activities within an activity diagram, and then you show a flow that this activity takes place first, then this activity, then this activity. There are elements within an activity diagram where you can show some kind of branching. So branching means that there are two activities which are going to take place in parallel. And similarly there are elements which can show so branching actually is not that is not really parallelism. There are different indicators for parallelism. Branching basically here means conditional branching, that there are two activities and only one of them will take place based on some conditions. So these kind of things can actually be represented in an activity diagram. And you can have activity diagrams at different levels. So if you assume that if you feel that there is a particular step in this activity, in this operation, which is actually rather complex, so then you can dissect it further and then divide it into a sub into sub activities. So these sub activities are often known as actions also. So you can show that within an activity these are the actions that were performed. So this is a simple example of what an activity diagram looks like. Again, you can see it looks very similar to how a flow chart is. And there are bifurcations based on conditions. If the condition is true, you go here. If the condition is false, you go here. Then there is a merging node, which means it's like this is the if else block, and this is the statement right after the if else block. And then you have a starting point and you have an ending point. This is similar to the state diagram. So this is how you try to showcase one, for example, one use case at a time associated with your system. And then within a particular activity, if you want to show more details, you can show it like this. And by the way, these are the parallelism indicators. So this here means a fork in computation. A fork is essentially saying that from here onwards there are two different activities which are going to take place in parallel. And then similarly, to join the flow which has been fogged, you can also use the same element again to show that from here onwards things are going to go in sync. So this is an example of activity diagrams. Any queries on this? Okay. So just to put everything in perspective, whenever you are going to use these interaction diagrams, there are a variety of interaction diagrams, and they depict different aspects of the system. So for you, you will have to figure out what exactly is the right way to showcase these things, right? Maybe a good way to do so is basically starting with with use case diagrams. You start and write down all the use cases. This is very similar to collecting your requirements. And then you create your class diagrams and state diagrams. And once you have done this, right, you can actually do the state diagrams later also. And then first do the sequence diagrams. It's up to you. the way you would like to do. But sequence diagrams and state diagrams, they basically go hand in hand most of the time. So together they provide a lot of information about your system's behavior. Activity diagrams are, as I said, they are a completely different thing altogether. You may or may not want to use them based on how much information do you want to show. So the activity diagrams are more useful when the person who wants to know about your system is more interested in the operations that the system performs rather than the data, okay, the objects. If that is the case, then activity diagrams is a good way to represent how your system performs certain use cases at the runtime. Okay, any questions? So if you don't have any questions, we will now move to the other part of this week, which is basically the system building skills. So maybe this will be a slightly uh, more interesting, I would say, because UI designing is something that I'm pretty sure, at least in the beginning, it does look exciting because you are now going to create components which appear on the screen, right? I mean, you can interact with them. So UI designing is a system building skill which I feel most of you will enjoy discussing. Okay, I mean, I know that we are doing it in a very fast pace, but the lecture content is anyhow available, so you can go through it and maybe have a look at it later. But let us start. So there are some very basic concepts associated with UI designing, and these concepts are more or less the same irrespective of where you are designing the UI. Okay, and let me also be very clear straight away that the UI designing that we are talking about here is the UI designing associated with building native applications. I'm not talking about HTML and CSS and all those things. Although CSS like scenarios are there, you can use some kind of styling sheets often in UI design, but we are focused more on the uh, design of a UI for a native application, not for web. Okay, so these window applications, they actually have something known as a main window. So all these windowing applications, that is the starting point, that you first need to know how can I create a main window using this toolkit, and then within this main window you lay down the widgets that you would like to add, right? um, this so-called main window can then spawn multiple windows. It can have multiple secondary windows. A typical example of a secondary window is, let us say you are working on some web page, and you try to submit a form, but an alert comes up, okay, and which says that you have not filled up these fields. So this alert is an example of a secondary window that appears over your primary window, and the reason for creating these secondary windows could be different. Okay, so for example, you may want to uh, share some information with the user. You may want to take some input from the user, right? It could be a prompt, for example. So there could be different reasons for creating these secondary windows, but these are there. You'll often see them. So the idea is that you start with a main window. These secondary windows could either be modal or non-modal in behavior. So what do you so these are two terms that you will often encounter when you are building UI. Modal uh, uh, modal windows are basically the windows which block the access to the main window. Okay, so as long as this modal window is there, you will not be able to interact with the main window. A typical example is these alerts that come up on on browsers. You cannot go back to the web page before clicking on OK, right? If you do not click on OK, you cannot go and interact with the web page. So this is an example of a modal window where the secondary window blocks the view, not just view. I mean, it basically blocks access to the main window. You have to first close it. And the non-modal windows are like independent windows. They are open, but you keep them separately. You can minimize them, maximize them. I'm not sure how many of you have used the help that used to come with the old Microsoft Word. That used to create a new window sometimes. That there will be a separate help window, okay, where you can. I think Windows help also looked something like this. That whenever you wanted help, a new window will come up, and this window is independent of the old window. You can, but yeah, it is still dependent, as in if you close the main window, the help window will go away as well, but you can minimize or maximize it independently without actually it will not block your access to the main window. So anyhow, so there are two types of secondary windows. You will create more types of windows as you'll create both these type of windows as you start working on UI design. The widgets are basically the different types of UI elements that you add to a window. So some examples of widgets are buttons. So you buttons are probably the most common widgets. Text boxes. A label is just a place where you show something to the user. It's just a place to show some text or images. You cannot interact with it directly, right? I mean, it's not clickable or anything. It's just a place where you show some text. There are scroll bars. You know what scroll bars are. Then there are drop down lists, check boxes, radio boxes. All these are widgets. Okay, these are UI elements that you add to a window. Or there are certain widgets which are also container widgets. Container widgets, as in they basically hold other widgets. They are like meta widgets. And the reason for using a container could be because you want to lay out the elements within a container using a different layout strategy. So what exactly is a layout strategy? So whenever you try to put these elements within a particular window or a container, one of the major challenge with designing UI is that most of the time, most of the systems will allow you to change the size of the window, right? So for example, if you are taking this lecture from your laptop, you can minimize or maximize the browser window or the WebEx app, right? You can change its size, you can shrink it, you can expand it. And whenever such a thing happens, how does the UI be changed, right? I mean, do you shrink the buttons, do you expand the buttons, do you keep the buttons of exactly the same size and put a scroll bar? All these details, right? All these questions are answered through a layouting strategy. So you need to figure out, you need to explicitly tell that what happens whenever there is a change in the container. Okay, the container could be a containing widget or the main window itself. So these layouting strategies, they tell you how should things be resized whenever there is a change in the size of the container. One of the more common layouts, it's, to me it looks very static. It doesn't really solve much problems, but yeah, it is a common layout. One of the most common layouting strategy is known as the grid layouting. So in grid layouting, you basically create grids. Okay, and then you put one component in each grid. Each grid is basically of the same size. And so then whenever there is a resizing that happens, all the components still remain of equal sizes. It's just that they all become small, or they all become stretched out. So something like this. So a grid layout looks like this. You have a container. This container could also be the main window, and this is a 2 cross 2 grid. So here it can house 4 different widgets. And when you put these widgets, it looks something like this: that there is a button here, there is a label here, there is a text area here, and then there could be another container widget in which there are more widgets like this. Okay, so the spacing between these widgets, this is usually configurable, but in many cases the default is 0. So basically all these widgets are they touch each other. Okay, there is no space in between by default. In many toolkits it could be the case. Now, whenever you are going to build UIs, one of the things that you will have to know is that the model of programming in UI is different. It's basically event based programming. Why? Because when you build a graphical user application, what really happens is that different UI elements need to have different behavior, right? So for example, if I click on a button, something should happen, some processing should happen when I click on a button. When I type something in a text box, I probably expect it to be auto filled or something like this, some suggestions for auto filling. So all these things, all these aspects of UI, it actually tells you that what really happens in a GUI application is that the user drives what is supposed to be done, right? So I can keep my Microsoft Word open throughout the day without actually clicking on any of the buttons, right? And nothing happens, no code is executed. But if I say file new, or if I say file save, then something happens, some processing happens in the background. So this is the whole idea of UI events and UI event handlers. So a UI event could be as simple as a mouse moving. So this is a UI event, by the way. I'm currently moving my mouse. So there is some UI event happening in the background, and it could be as complicated as I try to drag or and drop some element from another UI application to this, right? So that is also possible. So all these are examples of UI events. And when you are building a GUI application, you will have to figure out what UI events are important for your application, and then you will have to handle them. Handle them as in, the terminology is event handler. So you will have to provide an event handler for the different types of events that you want to respond to. So a typical example is you might want to handle the click event of a button. So you basically say, whenever this button gets clicked, please execute this code. That is the idea, that there is an event. This event is usually generated by users behavior, users actions. And the UI toolkit will provide you a way to provide some code which will be executed every time this particular UI event takes place. Okay. Another example of a UI event is, let us say I type something in a text box. That is also a UI event. You might want to show me, for example, some auto filling options, or you might minimize or maximize a window. So that is also, that there are certain players, I think YouTube also does that, that if it figures out that you have changed the tab, or you have minimized the browser window, I think it stops updating the video. Sometimes you can see it, sometimes when you change the tab and then change it back again, you can see that the frame that you see was the frame when you minimized it, or changed the tab. And as soon as you go back to the tab, the frame gets refreshed to the current frame. Sometimes, if your system is really fast, you might not be able to see it. But I have an experience of working with very slow systems, so this is something that you will see. So these are all UI events, and you are handling these UI events differently. So one last thing, there are two widgets that are often provided to you by your UI toolkit as a part of creating a new main window. It is the menu bar and a taskbar or status bar. There are different terms for it. Some call it taskbar, some call it status bar. So a menu bar, you all know, it looks like a menu on top of your window. And a menu bar can have multiple menus, and each menu can have multiple items within it. So for example, file, edit, help, these are all menus. And then there can be elements, there can be items within these menus, like new, save, exit, something like this. Within edit, you might have copy, cut, paste, so on and so forth. So these are often provided to you by your UI toolkit straight away. And there can be a status bar as well. So you've seen those these kind of icons. So this is basically a taskbar or a status bar, and this is how you should see a menu bar. So the next thing that you should do is try out Qt. Qt is a beautiful platform. I mean, since I used it, it has now become very popular. I mean, they have added support for Android and iOS. So there are so many things that you can do with Qt. You create your application at one place, and the applications will look exactly the same on different operating systems. So Qt is a very cool cross-platform UI toolkit, and the coding is done in C++. I think it might have extensions for coding in other languages as well, but primarily it is C++. There are two versions, open source and commercial. So we are going to now have a look at the open source version. There are some details given here. Please go through them when you actually install Qt and use. Any questions here? Or I'll just show you something from Qt. All right, we have around 15 minutes or so. So let us jump in and have a look at how Qt looks like. So I hope you guys can see my virtual machine. So exactly how do you install Qt? You can have a look at the lecture. I'm just going to show you how to use Qt. This is a very Qt creator. Pennsylvania bin. So this is what the Qt creator looks like. And one thing that you can do is I've already created a project here. So I'll just open this project. Let it parse everything. Do not show this again. So this is a typical Qt project. Uh, Here in the sources part and the headers part, I'll start with the headers. So this looks very similar to the kind of header files we've been creating all this file, right? It basically just has some declarations, public, private, so on and so forth. Then you have this CPP file where you are just providing some definitions for these header files. Now this is where Qt is different. There are these UI forms, okay, and they look something like this. Okay, you have these widgets on the left, okay, and then this is your main window. You can add so this is the menu bar, okay, and the good thing is you can pick up any of these widgets. Let us say this widget, and there is a property editor on the right here. Okay, it has so many properties that you can look at. Okay, so for example, if I want to change the text here, the text that is being displayed for this button, I can go and do that, saying sorry, uh, I am a button. Okay, so this is very simple, right? This is a property editor. You go and change the display for this button. This is a label. If you want to handle events, they are known as slots in Qt. So you just right click on it and say go to slot, and then you say I need to handle. So there are different types of events that a button can handle: clicked, then pressed, released, toggle. There are so many things. I don't know what exactly is clicked, bool, but yeah. So if you want to handle any particular event here, basically a function will be created for you like this. Okay, and you can add your code. So now whatever you want to do, whenever that particular button is clicked, you just come and write that thing here. Okay, so this is how you provide an event handler for any different kind, any UI event. There can be different types of UI events, and you can write code to handle different types of in all these events. So let me just discard everything, I would say. Mm, Let me just remove whatever I did. Okay, and then this place, at this place you can go and run this project. Here it is actually showing you that it is building something. So the building process, by the way, is very similar to what we guys do, right? It's basically called to there is a make file, and you just run that make file. So this is a typical application, a Qt application. You can see this is a window. Okay, it has been created using Qt, and here on this button, if you click whatever I did here, right, whatever I had written here. So I had written I wanted a see out statement, so that see out statement just came. I'm not sure whether you were able to see that or not. And then I said the label that is there, please change its text to something else, right? So that is all I did. This is the label, by the way. This was the label. Please don't click on the button. This was the label, and when you clicked on this button, its text was changed. And I also put something on the standard output, the console. You can keep on clicking here, and you can see that that piece of code is being called. Okay, then there are these layouting strategies. Let me first close it. Okay, so how do these layouting strategies work? This is the idea of a layouting strategy, that this is a vertical layout. In a vertical layout, whenever you add elements and whenever you add widgets to a vertical layout, they are added in a vertical fashion, okay, one below the other. And if you just remove this for a while, what happens is, if you keep on adding more buttons to it, they'll keep on getting added in a column. Okay, something like this. And this is the part that I was saying, this is what layout strategies do, that if you stretch this like this or like this, these buttons are automatically resized to fit inside its container. So this red thing, that is a container, and these are multiple elements, multiple widgets which are a part of this container. And the layouting strategy in for this particular container is vertical layout. So you basically lay out all the buttons or whatever widgets, and not just buttons. You can basically remove this button and add, let us say, something else, a radio button, for example. Okay, so all these are added in a vertical fashion, in a column. Okay, similarly, this is the, and if you want and now you can see that by default they will be equally spaced. Okay, all these widgets will be equally spaced. If you want these to be together, there are some spacer elements. So this is a vertical spacer, I can add it to the bottom. So now all these buttons are only going to take the minimum amount of height that is required, and then the spacer fills up all the rest. Okay, so if I uh, actually I'm not able to click on the layout. Yeah, so if I expand or shrink this layout now, the spacer element, it takes up all the space. The other elements are not being changed. So you can see, this is what this, I mean, just assume that you are using a window application, and you are increasing or decreasing its height. So how would you like your buttons to have to work out, right? I mean, one way to do it is like this. You want your buttons to become closer or farther from each other, like this, or you would like, as I just showed, them to be together. So this is an example of layouting, and this is an example of grid layout. So it's a 2 cross 2 grid in which I have put some elements. If I squeeze them, shrink them, the grids always remain of the same size. That is the idea. Okay. So this is an example of how layouting strategies work. The idea of layouting strategies are to basically manage whenever there is a change in the size of your elements. How does the underlying UI toolkit cater to it? That is the idea, and this is how they do it. So these are the two or three things that you need to know. There are widgets and there are layouting strategies, and whatever you want to do. For example, I have handled the quit action here. So if okay, I've already shown you the click part here. So the idea is you figure out what UI events are you supposed to handle for your particular case, and then you provide handlers for those events. So this is the typical steps. Number one, you create main windows and container elements. You decide upon the layouting strategies. So layouting strategies means how would your application look like when you resize the windows. The next thing that you do is you figure out what events are you planning to catch, or what events are you planning to handle, and then you supply some event handling code for it. Okay, so from my side, and by the way, you can go and in the on the console you can see exactly what happened. Um, I think it will be here, Qt projects. There will be a temporary folder like this. You can go and see what exactly happened here. So these are all the .o files, right? I mean, I'm not sure how many of you have executed some of the codes from week 7, week 6, week 5, but you can see these .o files there as well. So and then you have this make file. Okay. This one of course is a very complicated make file, but it looks something like this. Okay. It's a very complicated make file. There are so many things that are here, but um, but here you can see that these are some of the things that you have seen probably in your make files as well. So at the background, what really is happening, that Qt has a number of libraries, and these libraries get linked together to provide you a nice looking UI. Okay. Yeah, the .xml files basically, these UI toolkits, they are not really XML files. You can call them XML too because they are some kind of markup files, but they use these markup files to store styling information, which is similar to, let us say, a CSS. So yeah, you can edit those XML files as well. That is also possible. I've only given very brief overview of Qt. Um, uh, yeah, see, you will find commonalities in almost all windowing toolkits. Okay, any windowing toolkits will have an option of uh, sure, sure. You can use GUI, whatever you want. In fact, see, one of the reasons that I wanted I mean, I could not run this course the way I wanted it to, but I wanted you guys to try out all these things. I wanted you guys to try out networking, threading, GUI, everything, right? It's just that the course did not go the way I planned it to. But yeah, if you want to use GUI, please go ahead and use Qt. Qt is a very good cross-platform tool. Please use it. And it's so basically, sure, you'll have to build it separately for separate platforms. And so for example, if you are doing it on Windows, you'll have to see how to create an exe out of it. If you are building it for Linux, I think it's just a typical Linux executable. If you are building it on Mac, so basically for different platforms, the actual final executable will be different. It doesn't mean that the same executable will run on different platforms. No, that is not going to happen. But the same code base, if you take it to Mac, you can you can build a Mac application out of it. If you take it to Windows, you can create a Windows application out of it. That is the idea with cross platform. and you can do it for Android, I think, and iOS and everything in Qt. It's just that I did not install everything. It's a huge suite. If you install everything in Qt, it is around 15 GB or so. I just installed the basic version, the desktop version, but you can install all kinds of stuff with Qt. Okay, any queries? And please, if you guys wish to, I'll be very happy to see some UI. It doesn't mean that I'm forcing you to use UI. Okay, it's up to you. It's just that when I had planned this subject, when I planned the course content, I had so many things in my mind. It's just that I could not run this course the way I wanted to. Anyhow, okay. Any questions? Okay, then please have fun with Qt. It's I mean it is something which I feel will be interesting for you guys, right? I mean you can do so much of stuff. So and all you need to know is some basic C++, plus plus, and then you'll have to watch some Qt tutorials. There are many Qt tutorials on YouTube. Just pick any one of them, and maybe you can start building your own window applications. Okay, guys. Thank you. Bye.